Beaver County, Oklahoma, October 1935. The wind had a taste. It was the taste of Texas topsoil and Colorado rock, a fine grit that worked its way into a man's teeth and the folds of his children's ears. It was a constant whining reminder that the world had come loose from its moorings. On this particular afternoon, the sun was a pale, dusty coin in a sky the color of rust. And in this world of horizontal movement, Vasyl Kravchuk was doing something vertical, something foolish. He was working on an abandoned implement shed. It wasn't a structure so much as a suggestion of one. A 16 by 22-foot box of corrugated tin panels bolted to a flimsy frame, its original red paint scoured away by years of wind, leaving a mottled patina of decay. It had been left to die in a fallow field, and Vasyl had dragged it, panel by groaning panel, to his small, wind-blasted plot of land. Hollis Whitcomb, the county extension agent, pulled his Ford Model A to a stop, the dust settling around it like a slow-motion shroud. With him was Jedediah Stokes, a farmer from 2 miles down the section line whose face was a roadmap of droughts and foreclosures. They watched Vasyl for a long moment. The Ukrainian was not nailing or sawing. He was meticulously, almost reverently, pressing strips of tar-soaked canvas into the seams where the tin panels overlapped. His movements were economical, precise, those of a man who had done similar work 1,000 times before, though never on a building. "What in God's name is he building?" Stokes muttered, squinting against the glare off the metal. "He calls it a house," Whitcomb said. His voice was flat, devoid of malice, but heavy with the certainty of his own expertise. He was a man of science, of crop rotation and soil conservation. He understood the physics of the prairie, and what he saw was a violation of them all. Thinks he can winter his family in a tin can. They got out and walked over. The air smelled of hot tar and dry earth. Vasyl looked up, his face smudged, his eyes a startling blue in his sun-darkened face. He nodded a greeting. "Kravchuk," Whitcomb began, foregoing any pleasantry. "We were just talking in town. The WPA administrator sent me out. You put in for relief, but this is not a habitable dwelling. It's a metal shed. The wind will peel it open before the first real blizzard. It'll be an icebox by December. This is foolishness." Stokes kicked at a loose stone. "My dugout's got walls 3 foot thick, and the cold still finds its way in. That tin will be like living inside a frost-covered nail." Vasyl looked at the seam he had just finished, running a calloused thumb over the dark, sticky canvas. He looked at the vast, empty sky. Then he looked at the two men. "This will be warm," he said, his English thick but clear. He then turned back to his work, dipping another strip of canvas into the bucket of hot tar, his silence a more profound dismissal than any argument. The men saw a madman trying to patch a sieve. They saw a family doomed to a winter of misery. They saw a crazy Ukrainian farmer building a metal tomb. What did this Ukrainian smith mechanic, a man who had spent his life tuning the breath of forges in the damp, black earth of Volhynia, understand about a sealed envelope that the county extension agent, an expert in prairie agriculture, had missed? This story is about the difference between a wall that fights the wind and a skin that ignores it. It's a story about forgotten knowledge and the quiet genius of a perfect seal. I promise you, by the end of this, you will understand the devastating power of a single draft and the profound physics behind a simple strip of tarred canvas. If you've ever felt a cold draft in your own home, tell us in the comments where it was coming from. And as we go on this journey, consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss more stories of ingenuity from the frontiers of survival. Vasyl Kravchuk was not a carpenter. He had never framed a wall, raised a barn, or chinked a log cabin. He was not a farmer, though he now found himself on land that broke plows and hearts with equal indifference. In his homeland near Zhytomyr, he had been a smith mechanic, a man whose hands understood the language of metal. His world had been one of forge bellows, rivet heads, steam boilers, and tin sheeting. He knew the precise pressure needed to join two pieces of metal so they could hold 200 pounds of steam pressure. He knew the viscous, patient magic of linseed and tar compounds, how they could turn a simple overlapping seam into a joint as impermeable as a solid plate. His hands thought in terms of gaskets, tolerances, and seals. The American frontier, with its endless demand for wood and sod, was a foreign vocabulary. He had brought his wife, Oksana, and their two children, 10-year-old Levko and 7-year-old Solomia, to Oklahoma with the promise of land. They arrived in 1934 at the height of the drought. The land they bought was cheap because it was worthless, a patch of earth that had given up and was now trying to fly away to Kansas. Their first winter was not a hardship. It was a lesson in torment delivered by the laws of thermodynamics. They lived in a hastily constructed shack made of reclaimed planking and hope. The cold that winter was a physical entity. It was not an absence of heat. It was a presence, an intruder that sat at their table and lay in their beds. Vasyl remembered the morning the temperature hit 30 below. He went to start a neighbor's Ford Model A small kindness in exchange for some flour. He put the crank handle to the engine block, gave it a hard turn, and the steel shaft, crystallized by the cold, snapped with a sound like a pistol shot. The metal itself had surrendered. Inside the shack, the misery was quieter but more intimate. Oksana had a small can of hairspray she'd bought in a moment of optimism, a luxury from another life. One morning, they heard a sharp pop from the cabinet. The pressurized atomizer had burst, its delicate mechanism destroyed by the contracting cold. The most brutal lesson, however, came from their sourdough starter. Oksana kept it alive with religious devotion, a bubbling, living link to her mother's kitchen in Ukraine. She would feed it by the stove, then move it to the table to make bread. The 10-foot journey from the relative warmth of the stove to the frigid air of the room was enough. The yeast, stunned by the thermal shock, would go dormant. The dough, when she tried to bake it, cured into a dense, pull-apart brick, a bread-shaped stone that mocked their hunger. That winter taught Vasyl a fundamental truth. The problem wasn't the cold outside. The problem was the air inside, which was just the outside air visiting. The conventional wisdom of Beaver County was no match for the relentless physics of the Dust Bowl. The standard dwelling was either a sod dugout, a cave scraped from the unforgiving earth, or a single-wall frame house built of pine that had been shipped in at great expense. Both were thermal failures for the same reason. The thick walls of Jedediah Stokes's dugout should have provided ample insulation. Sod, with its trapped air and organic mass, had a respectable R value, but the structure leaked, not water, but air. Air seeped in where the roof joists met the sod walls. It crept in around the ill-fitting door and the single glass pane window. Every homesteader knew the signs. The candle flame that never stood still, always flickering and dancing in an unseen current. The fine layer of dust that appeared on every surface, even with the doors and windows shut tight. This wasn't just a nuisance, it was a catastrophic energy drain. The problem wasn't conduction, heat leaching slowly through a solid wall. The problem was infiltration, the wholesale replacement of warm interior air with cold exterior air. A 60-mile-per-hour wind pressing against a house creates a powerful pressure differential. The high pressure on the windward side forces cold air in through every crack, while the low pressure on the leeward side sucks warm air out. In a typical frame house, the entire volume of air could be replaced 10 or 15 times an hour. This meant the stove wasn't just heating the house, it was attempting to heat all of Oklahoma, 1 cubic foot at a time. Families like the Stokeses burned through their winter supply of firewood and cow chips by January, their meager fuel sources consumed in a frantic, losing battle against the invading cold. They stuffed rags in cracks, nailed canvas over windows, and piled dirt against the foundations, but it was never enough. The wind was too powerful, too pervasive. It was a thief that stole BTUs, the tiny units of heat that meant the difference between survival and frostbite. The settlers were building forts, but the enemy was a gas. It didn't lay siege. It simply passed through the walls. They were trying to solve the problem with mass when the solution lay in something far more subtle, a perfect, unbroken seal. Vasyl's work on the shed began not with a hammer, but with a bucket and a brush. He'd bartered 2 days of engine repair for a barrel of crude tar and a dozen worn-out canvas grain sacks from the cooperative. His first task was deconstruction. He carefully unbolted each corrugated panel, numbering them with chalk. He laid them on the ground and inspected every edge, every rivet hole, every scar left by time and weather. This was not a carpenter examining wood. It was a mechanic diagnosing a machine. His process was methodical. For every seam where 2 panels would overlap, he cut a 2-inch wide strip of canvas. He'd heat a small pot of tar over a fire until it was liquid and pungent, then paint a thick layer onto the edge of 1 tin panel. He'd lay the canvas strip over the hot tar, pressing it down firmly, then paint another layer of tar over the canvas, saturating it completely. Finally, he would bring the corresponding panel, lay it in place, and bolt them together. The pressure squeezed out a thin black bead of tar, creating a gasket that filled every microscopic imperfection in the metal. It was the same principle he'd used to seal boiler plates in Jitomer, a joint held by pressure, made perfect by a flexible, impermeable membrane. He repeated this for every single seam, every edge, every place where metal met metal. He sealed the roof panels, the wall panels, and the corners. He hammered the old rivet holes closed and sealed them with a daub of the same tarred canvas. To an onlooker, it was tedious, nonsensical work. To Vasyl, it was the most important work of all. He was building the skin first. It was during this phase that Hollis Whitcomb made his official inspection. He arrived with a clipboard and a grave expression. Oksana stood by the shed, her hands wrapped in her apron, watching the county man. Levko and Solomia peeked from behind her. Whitcomb walked around the structure, tapping the tin with his knuckle. It made a dull, solid thud where Vasyl had bolted it together. He noted the black lines of tar bleeding from the seams. He made a few notes on his clipboard. "Mr. Kravchuk," he said, his tone formal, "as I told you, I cannot in good conscience approve this structure as habitable. It's an outbuilding." The Works Progress Administration has standards for housing relief, and this does not meet them. It has no foundation, insufficient framing, and the siding is rusted tin. I'm required to file a report with the Extension Office. Your family's WPA relief eligibility will be denied based on this inspection. It was an economic death sentence. The small relief check was what bought flour, salt, and the few other things their barren land couldn't provide. Losing it meant a winter of true hunger. Vasyl wiped his tar-blackened hands on a rag. He looked at Whitcomb, then at Oksana, whose face had gone pale. He nodded slowly, accepting the verdict as one more feature of this harsh landscape. "I understand," he said. He did not argue. He did not plead. He simply picked up his brush and turned back to sealing the last panel. The agent had seen a list of deficiencies. Vasyl saw a single, elegant solution. With the outer shell complete, he moved inside. He built a rudimentary interior frame of 2x2s, salvaged from a collapsed fence line, creating a 4-inch gap between the new frame and the tin skin. Upon this frame, he nailed a lattice of thin lath. Then came the final, crucial step. He, Oksana, and even the children spent a week mixing clay, water, and straw into a thick, heavy daub. They packed this mixture into the 4-inch cavity, forcing it between the lath and the tin, tamping it down until the entire structure was filled. It was back-breaking, messy work. When they were done, the thin tin shed had 4-inch thick walls of packed straw mud. The mockery from the neighbors continued, but it was quieter now, laced with a grudging respect for the sheer amount of labor. They still thought he was a fool, but a hard-working one. The genius of Vasyl Kravchuk's shed was not in its materials, but in its understanding of two distinct thermal principles: stopping air infiltration and slowing heat conduction. Hollis Whitcomb and the other settlers were fighting a battle on one front, trying to slow conduction with thick walls, while completely losing the war to infiltration. Let's break down the physics. First, the seal. The tar canvas gaskets Vasyl so painstakingly applied transformed the shed. A conventional shack full of tiny, unsealed cracks might have an air exchange rate of 15 air changes per hour, ACH, in a high wind. This means every 4 minutes, all the warm air inside has been completely replaced by cold air from outside. Vasyl's shed, with every seam and rivet hole hermetically sealed, was aiming for an ACH of less than 1. The wind could howl against the tin, but it couldn't get in. It was like the difference between wearing a wool sweater and wearing a waterproof windbreaker over that sweater. One is porous, the other presents an impenetrable barrier to the wind. This single act of creating a vapor-tight, windproof envelope was more important than any amount of insulation. It meant the small wood stove inside was only tasked with heating a single, stable volume of air. It was no longer fighting the entire panhandle. Second, the insulation. Once the air was trapped, the goal was to keep it warm. This is where the straw mud came in. Heat moves by conduction, the process of energy transferring from molecule to molecule. The rate at which it moves is measured by an R value. A higher R value means slower heat transfer. The corrugated tin of the shed had an R value of perhaps 0.5. It was barely better than nothing. But the 4-inch layer of packed straw and clay, what modern builders call straw clay or light clay, was a remarkably effective insulator. The straw traps thousands of tiny air pockets, and still air is a terrible conductor of heat. This composite wall had an R value of approximately 8. When combined, the system was formidable. The unsealed tin shed was an R1 disaster. Vasyl's sealed, insulated shed was a cohesive R9 system. But the numbers tell an even more dramatic story. On a day when it was 20 degrees outside, with a 60 mph wind, the wind chill was a life-threatening 70 degrees. Inside a standard leaky shack, the interior temperature might struggle to reach 10 degrees above zero. But in Vasyl's shed, the math was different. The R9 insulation, combined with the near-zero air infiltration, meant the small stove and the body heat of 4 people could easily raise the interior temperature by 40 or 50 degrees. A 20-degree day outside could mean a 30-degree reality inside. It wasn't a sauna, but it was the difference between life and death. Whitcomb saw rust and poverty. Vasyl had built a thermal machine. That January, the sky turned red-brown at noon. It wasn't a storm that arrived. It was a wall that descended. A black blizzard, the apex predator of the Dust Bowl, rolled in from the south. For 4 days, the world ceased to exist outside a 10-foot circle of visibility. The wind did not gust. It was a solid, unrelenting force of 60 miles per hour, carrying a blinding mix of red dust and fine, dry snow that felt like sand against the skin. The temperature plunged to 24 poundagangers and stayed there, a frozen floor beneath the screaming wind. Outside, it was a maelstrom. Tumbleweeds cartwheeled past at impossible speeds. The air was so thick with dust you could not tell where the ground ended and the sky began. It was an apocalypse in monochrome, a world reduced to wind and grit. Inside the Stokes' dugout, the storm was an occupying army. Every nailhead on the interior walls was white with a perfect circle of frost, a tiny thermal bridge conducting the killing cold straight through the wood. The single window was opaque, coated not on the outside, but on the inside, with a thick, fern-like pattern of ice. Jedediah and his wife kept the stove glowing cherry red, feeding it precious wood and dung. But the heat was stolen as fast as it was produced. The air was a torrent of invisible currents, and the fine red dust settled on their blankets, in their water, in their lungs. Inside Vasyl Kravchuk's tin shed, there was stillness. The sound of the storm was immense, a deafening, continuous roar, but it was a muffled roar, the sound of a distant ocean. The walls did not tremble or vibrate. The packed earth inside them absorbed the fury. There were no drafts. A candle flame on the small table Oksana used for mending stood perfectly upright, a tiny, unwavering spear of light. This was where the miracle was most apparent, in the small details of domestic life. Oksana was rendering lard on the cook stove. In any other dwelling, the smell would have been whipped around the room, pulled toward a dozen drafts. Here it hung in a pleasant, savory cloud, a testament to the stillness of the air. On the floor, on a small rag rug, Levko and Solomia were not huddled under a mountain of quilts. They were drawing on a piece of slate, their coats unbuttoned. The air was cool, not warm, but it was a stable, livable cool, free from the wind that leached the very heat from a person's bones. The single deadliest element of the prairie winter, the wind, was raging a few inches from their heads, but it was locked outside. They were living in the calm eye of the hurricane. The shed wasn't fighting the storm. It was simply not participating in it. On the third day of the blizzard, Hollis Whitcomb was near his breaking point. He'd been out in his Model A, trying to check on families he knew were isolated and low on fuel. The world beyond his windshield was a nightmare of swirling dust and snow. He was navigating by memory and instinct when the engine sputtered and died. Adrift, a solid wave of dust and ice had blocked the road, and he'd run right into it. The car was stuck fast. He was 800 yards from the Kravchuk place. He knew it was his only chance. He wrapped his scarf around his face, pulled his ear flaps down, and stepped out into the gale. The force of the wind knocked him back a step. The cold was instantaneous and savage. It felt like a physical blow, a pressure on his chest. The 800-yard walk was a desperate, stumbling pilgrimage. The frozen dust caked his glasses, blinding him. He navigated by keeping the roar of the wind at a constant angle to his right ear. He fell twice. The breath knocked from his lungs. He was beginning to feel the deep, seductive numbness of hypothermia when he bumped into something solid. The shed. He fumbled for the door, his gloved hands clumsy and useless. He found the simple wooden latch and pushed. The door swung inward on its leather hinges. He stumbled inside and forced it shut against the wind. And then, the shock. He had expected to enter a scene of frigid misery, a mirror of the howling chaos he had just left. He expected the air to be just as cold, just as full of dust, only still. He expected to find a family huddled together, on the verge of freezing. What he felt was calm. The air was still. It was cool, but it was not the biting, aggressive cold of the outside. It was a passive coolness, a cellar-like tranquility. The roaring of the wind was gone, replaced by a dull, low hum. He could feel the warmth from the small stove radiating on his face. He pulled off his gloves. His hands ached as the blood returned. He unwrapped the scarf from his face and took a deep breath. The air was clean. It tasted of wood smoke and cooking, not of dirt. Then he realized he was sweating inside his heavy coat. He reached up and, without thinking, pulled the frozen ear flaps of his cap up and away from his head. He looked at his watch. He had been inside for less than a minute. His eyes, now clear of dust, took in the scene. Vasyl sat at a small table, sharpening a tool. Oksana was humming quietly as she stirred a pot. The two children were asleep under a modest pile of blankets, their breathing peaceful and deep. It was a scene of impossible, defiant normalcy. Then Whitcomb's eyes fell upon a small shelf near the stove. On it sat a glass jar filled with dark red spheres floating in a clear liquid, pickled sour cherries. He knew that in every dugout and shack for 100 miles, any liquid in a glass jar would be a solid block of ice. The brine in the Stokes' pickle crock had frozen and split the thick ceramic walls 2 weeks ago. But here, the syrup in this jar was perfectly, impossibly liquid. It was the proof. It was the irrefutable physical evidence that everything he thought he knew about shelter on the prairie was wrong. He looked at Vasyl, who had stopped his work and was watching him with his calm, blue eyes. Whitcomb's face, a mask of cold and exhaustion, crumpled with the weight of a monumental revelation. He didn't offer an apology. An apology was insufficient for the scale of his misjudgment. "How?" Whitcomb asked, his voice cracking. Vasyl gestured to the walls, to the seams. "No air," he said simply. "The wind must stay outside." Whitcomb walked to the wall and placed his bare palm against the interior lath and plaster. It was cool, but it wasn't the life-stealing cold of a nail-head. It was just a cool wall. He looked at the sealed seams, the humble materials. He saw it not as a collection of parts, but as a single, functioning system. He shook his head, a slow gesture of awe. "My God, Kravchuk," he breathed. "You didn't build a house. You built a sealed drum." When the blizzard finally broke, Hollis Whitcomb did not file his original report. He tore it up. In its place, he wrote a new one, a detailed 4-page account of what he had witnessed in the Kravchuk shed. He described the tar canvas gaskets, the straw mud insulation, and the astonishing temperature differential. He called it the Kravchuk sealed wall method. He sent the report not just to the WPA office, who promptly reinstated Vasyl's relief eligibility, but also to the editor of the Oklahoma Farmers Union Cooperative Circular. The story caused a stir. In a land of constant struggle, a story of such simple, effective success was a powerful draw. That spring, the Circular published a full-page article titled "A Tin Can Against the Black Blizzard." It featured a detailed, hand-drawn diagram by Whitcomb himself, showing exactly how to cut and apply the tar canvas gaskets. It listed the materials, all of them cheap, all of them readily available. The idea spread like fire in dry grass. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival, and just as importantly, economy. The article calculated that a family using the Kravchuk method could expect to reduce their winter fuel consumption by over 70%. For families spending what little cash they had on coal or spending precious time gathering cow chips, this was revolutionary. By the autumn of 1936, the landscape of the Panhandle began to change. 9 families across Beaver, Texas, and Cimarron counties, all of them living on the razor's edge of failure, had located abandoned sheds, dragged them to their homesteads, and begun the meticulous process of sealing them. They became known as the Tin Can Homesteaders. They faced the same mockery Vasyl had, but they had his story and Whitcomb's report as armor. That next winter, another brutal one, their stories trickled back to the extension office. Families warm, children healthy, fuel piles barely touched. The quiet Ukrainian's idea was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming the new conventional wisdom. What Vasyl Kravchuk accomplished in that dusty Oklahoma field was a quiet anticipation of modern building science. Today, we have names for what he was doing through instinct and experience. His tar canvas gaskets created what we now call an air barrier, or a vapor seal. His meticulous attention to sealing every seam is the core principle behind modern high-performance construction, which uses blower door tests to measure air changes per hour, striving for the same air tightness Vasyl achieved with tar and scraps. His straw mud insulation is a precursor to the natural building materials, straw bale, hempcrete, light clay, that are gaining recognition for their low cost and excellent thermal performance. Vasyl wasn't following a blueprint. He was applying a fundamental principle he had learned in a different context. He had built a structure that performed not because of what it was made of, but because of how it was assembled. He demonstrated that a humble, well-sealed shed could outperform a massive, leaky dugout, proving that on the frontier, as in building science, intelligence is always more powerful than brute force. There is a deep and resonant lesson in the story of the Kravchuk shed. In the face of the Dust Bowl's overwhelming force, the instinct was to build bigger, thicker, stronger, to build a fortress against the wind. But Vasyl Kravchuk did not build a fortress. He did not engage the wind in a contest of strength, a fight he knew he would lose. Instead, he chose a different path. He redefined the problem. The goal was not to defeat the wind, but to make it irrelevant. He took a forgotten, rusted piece of industrial debris, an object of no value, and through meticulous care, he asked it to become a perfect boundary. He asked it to be a wall the family could close behind them. Inside that thin, sealed skin, the world of the black blizzard, the world of dust and killing cold, simply ceased to be. He didn't build a house to stand against the storm. He built a small, quiet room where the storm was not invited, proving that true shelter is not about confronting the wilderness, but about creating a small, deliberate pocket of peace within it. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet ingenuity. If you found the science and the history compelling, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of survival and innovation. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What other modern building techniques do you see reflected in Vasyl's work? Let us know in the comments below. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.